Okay, so we just talked about characters, and now we're going to talk about the narrator. And the narrator is the person telling the story, right? So I'm going to have a video about this later on, but we have, there are different degrees of separation, right? So we have Tim O'Brien, who's the author, right? So Tim O'Brien lives in our world, the real world, and he wrote this book. And then inside the stories, we have a narrator, right? Which is the persona that's telling the story. And that narrator is not the same as the author. So, when you get into your papers and you're talking about narrators versus authors, that's something you'll have to keep track of. But anyway, who's the narrator in this story? And what's the point of view? Okay? So let's ask ourselves, is the narrator a character in the story? Is he participating in the story? And he's really not, right? Is the story told in the first person? Does it use pronouns like I, me, or we? No, it really doesn't, right? Is it a second person? Does it use you? Does it address the readership as you? No, it doesn't do that either. So we're left with a third person point of view, or third person narrator, okay? So someone who's seeing, we have a narrator who sees all of these events and is describing them but isn't really participating, okay? Now, what's the point of view? Is it limited or is it omniscient? And the difference between that is, are we basically just looking at things from one point of view? Maybe we're in one person's mind, or we're hovering over one person's shoulder, and we just have the point of view that's limited from that point, right? We're not in every single person's head. Or is this an omniscient narrator who knows everything about everyone and moves in and out of other people's heads? So think about that, and which one of those would you say that we've got? I think we've got probably like a limited omniscient, if that makes any sense. We are definitely in Jimmy Cross's head, right? We start the story with Jimmy Cross, we end the story with Jimmy Cross. We know what he thinks about Martha, even though he's not quite sure what Martha thinks about him. We know, we get the interior monologue of Jimmy Cross, right? We know his thoughts about Martha. We know about his thoughts regarding Ted Lavender's death. We know how he changes as a person inside at the end of the story. So for the most part, we're limited to that point of view. But there's also a time, at least one time, when we move into Kiowa's head, right? So this is on page 645. He's telling the story to Norman Bowker, and we have a passage, so shrugging, Kiowa pulled off his boots. He wanted to say more just to lighten up his sleep, but instead he opened his New Testament and arranged it beneath his head in a pillow. He tried not to think about Ted Lavender, but then he was thinking about how fast it was, no drama, down and dead, how it was hard to feel anything except surprise. So for this passage, we're not in Jimmy Cross's head anymore. We're stuck in Kiowa's head, or Kiowa's head. I don't know how you want to say it. So I don't think we're not in every single character's head. We don't have an absolute omniscient narrator, but we do have a narrator who's sort of able to pass through walls, right? And shift point of view. So I would say it's mostly a limited narrator with a little bit of omniscience. He can move from one character's shoulder to another character's shoulder, or inside one character's head to another character's head. But we still don't get every single perspective, and we don't get to know, we don't know what's happening with Martha. So if this were really an omniscient narrator, an absolutely omniscient narrator, we would know what's going on in Jimmy Cross's head, but then the narrator would also say, this is what Jimmy thinks about Martha, and this is actually what Martha is doing back home. So in a sense, it's omniscient in that we can switch from point of view to point of view, but once we're locked into that point of view, all we see is that tunnel vision, right? Once we're there as Jimmy Cross, we don't get to know what Martha thinks. Once we're there as Kiowa, we've forgotten Jimmy Cross, and all we have is that perspective. So I think we only have a couple of different perspectives, 2 or 3 maybe, and they're mostly limited with the ability to move back and forth from character to character. One other thing I wanted to mention, is this narrator reliable? And I think that the narrator himself is reliable. We'll get to, I'm sure we'll run into stories where, the narrator, as he's telling the story, is totally BSing all the characters in the story. He's BSing the reader, he's saying things that we all know are not true. Is that the case in this story? I don't think it is. I think, we can talk about whether or not Jimmy Cross is really responsible for Ted Lavender's death. He thinks so, doesn't he? He thinks that he's so obsessed with Martha that, this obsession, him not having his mind in the right spot, led to Lavender's death. But do you guys really believe that? The more I think about it, the more I think that there's really, this is war. There's nothing that he could have done to stop that. Ted Lavender goes off to pee. He's away from everyone else, and that's just the circumstances, and it leads to his death. So in a way, I think that, Jimmy Cross has this guilt that's maybe unfounded in a way, but I don't think that makes for an unreliable narrator. The narrator is reliable in that he's telling us what Jimmy Cross feels, and then whether Jimmy Cross feels appropriately or not is up for debate. But I think that the narrator, for the most part, is reliable, and we're sort of getting mixed signals from Jimmy Cross once we're in his head. So that's just a little bit, little discussion of narrator's point of view and how you might in the future run into an unreliable narrator, although I think we have a reliable narrator in this story.